regions of Europe. So far, we have done 7 sessions, hosted more than 30 prominent scholars, and covered Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, the Balkan region, Europe's heartland, and as well as the Baltic countries and Belarus. Our panelists have provided expert insight into national trends of populist development and far-right movements across Europe. The aim is to have a complete picture of populism in Europe following the conclusion of this panel series. After each session, ECPS publishes a panel report alongside a video recording on its website. Through this, we hope to provide an invaluable source of information, not only for scholars, but also for a wider audience, including policymakers concerned by the current challenges to democracy in Europe. Starting in 2023, we will start with 3 thematic sessions, in which this one will be the first one. Then we will be moving beyond the borders of Europe and expanding this project to include cases of populism around the world. After this brief explanation, I am excited to introduce our panelist and moderator today. Our moderator is Dr. Agnieszka Graf. She's a professor at the American Studies Center at the University of Warsaw and a feminist activist. Her research interests include gender studies, feminist history, nationalism, and public discourse on gender. Her articles have appeared in Science, East European Politics and Societies, Public Culture, Feminist Studies, European Journal of Women's Studies, and many collected volumes. Dr. Graf is the author of 4 books of feminist essays in Polish. She also co-authored a monograph titled Anti-Gender Politics in the Populist Moment with Dr. Elżbieta Korosuk, which happens to be our second panelist. She is an associate professor in sociology at Södertörn University in Stockholm, Sweden, and American Studies Center at Warsaw University. Dr. Korosuk will give a presentation on explaining the relation between populism and gender in Europe. Her research interests involve gender, social movements, civil society, politics of reproduction, and anti-gender campaigns. She has published numerous articles, books, and book chapters, as an example on parents and women's movements, on new forms of citizenship, politicization and reproduction, and anti-gender mobilization in Poland and abroad. We then have Dr. Eric Louis Russell. He's a professor in the Department of French and Italian and affiliated with the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Russell will give a lecture under the title Language of Reaction, Europe Populist Radical Right and LGBTQA+ Rights. His research interests include linguistic analysis of discourse practices, social media, language, hegemonist masculinities and sexualities, gender in and through language, taboo language, such as insults, offenses, and censorship. The discursive ecology of homophobia, unraveling anti-LGBTQ language on the European far right, is among his latest books. Dr. Russell has also published articles in the Journal of Pidgin and Creole Languages, the Journal of Language and Sexuality, Language Science, Language and Gender, and the Journal of French Language Studies, as well as chapters in several edited volumes. Our third speaker is Nick Linders. He's a PhD candidate at Gender and Diversity Studies from Social Cultural Research at Radboud University, Nijmegen. He will do a presentation on gender and sexuality in Dutch populist voters' profiles. He's currently working on a project addressing the dynamics of gender and sexuality in the Dutch populist radical right. His other research interests include increase into processes of radicalization and analyzing the mainstream of radical extremist ideas and conspiracy theories. And finally, we have Dr. Pauline Cullen. She's an associate professor in sociology at Centre for European and Eurasian Studies at Maynooth University in Ireland. She will give us a lecture on populism and the backlash against gender equality, feminist responses to right-wing populism in Europe. Dr. Cullen's work examines civil society mobilizations on social justice and gender equality at national and European Union level, women's movement and gender and political representation. She has also worked as a gender expert for advocacy organizations, working on gender justice and equality issues. So before giving the floor to our moderator, I just want to remind you that you will have 15 minutes for your respective presentations. Since we are on a tight schedule, I will inform you when you have only 3 minutes left. Once the time is exceeded, I will have to interrupt you to move on, so please pardon me in advance. And now, please, our moderator, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to all the panelists for sending me some sneak previews of their talks. I want to start by saying that we will probably be using the word gender in two meanings. One is the established one, gender as it functions in gender studies, sociology, and so on, the word we all know. And the other is less familiar, or at least was until anti-gender campaigns became the thing all around Europe. It is the meaning that the populist right and the radical right has endowed this word with. And it is an example of resignification, which I think will end up in linguistic history books in the future. It's quite astonishing what they've achieved. And the spectacular success of this resignification is, I think, something we'll be talking about. So gender, as the word is used by the populist right, is the equivalent of liberal norms, of the sexual revolution, of abortion, of sexual rights, very broadly understood. In different countries, the meaning is slightly different depending on what the hot button issue is. But the general idea is that gender is that which is unsettling. It is that which makes liberalism itself suspect and worthy of challenging. It is excessive individualism, it is consumerism, it is the dissolution of communities, falling fertility rates, and it is a set of images that the populist right has established. And again, I'm quite astonished, having studied this phenomenon for years, by how complex, sophisticated, and spectacular this imagery is. I usually, when I talk about it, I show lots of pictures. I'm quite fascinated by these images, but I've decided to refrain and just talk about it. Talk about the cultural repertoire that the anti-gender campaigns have amassed. And it differs in different countries. For instance, Italian anti-gender imagery is incredibly chic. Polish anti-gender imagery tends to be more raw and sort of peasant-oriented. In France, they have a lot of references to the French Revolution. But there are, of course, resonances between these images. There are a lot of dissolving families, as opposed to families holding hands, often in silhouette. There are dangerous perverts, images of people whose gender is hard to establish and who look threatening. There are alienating and suffering children. Sometimes there are fetuses, but more often there are 4- or 5-year-olds who look terrified. There are also lots of children for sale. Elżbieta and I have talked a lot about this, children with barcodes, women's bellies with barcodes on them. So the idea is that there is a connection between gender equality and sexual rights and capitalism in its most threatening versions. And that I think is still waiting to be explored, how these barcodes really do cultural work of undermining, of positioning right-wing populists as opponents and defenders of the masses against the excesses of capitalism. So it is more, I think, of a culture than a set of arguments, anti-genderism. As we argue in our book, it functions in close collusion with populism on a variety of levels. The images that are one sphere where this happens, this association of gender with the elites and ordinary people with gender conservatism, but there are also economic aspects of this collusion. There are discursive aspects, and there are, of course, political institutional connections. And before I get us off to the 3 presentations, I want to mention briefly 3 examples from 3 European countries. In each case, politicians who had long collaborated with ultra-conservative organizations engage in targeting gender ideology to mobilize electorates. And I want to argue that mobilizing people is the basic and primary goal of these campaigns. But there's a longer term aim, which is associating the opposition with gender perversion, threat to ordinary people. So here are my three examples. The first one is 2019, and since then also in Poland, where in response to Mayor of Warsaw signing a declaration counteracting discrimination against sexual minorities, a number of local authorities, mostly in southeastern Poland, initiated a campaign to protect traditional families. And as a result, and I think you must have seen this in the media, over 100 municipalities declared to be themselves to be zones free from LGBT ideology. And this, of course, put Poland on a collision track with the EU, which in a way was also the aim. The aim was to legitimize anti-European discourse of the ruling party. What is interesting from the point of view of collusion between populists and anti-gender groups is that Poland's key anti-gender organization was actually the behind this campaign, and this group is called Ordo Juris, and it's quite big and well funded, and I'm sure Elżbieta will mention it because it's hard to talk about Poland without mentioning it. My second example, and one where I was really tempted to show you a picture, but maybe you've seen them, is Spain. Where Vox, the radical right party, won elections in 2019, becoming the third political power in Spain, something unforeseen by most commentators and unseen since the reinstatement of democracy following Franco in Spain, due to two things. And I don't want to undermine the main reason. The main reason is that people were reacting to the Catalan independence movement and voting for nationalists. But there is the second element, which is interesting from our point of view, which is the party's extremely effective collaboration with Haste Oir, a radical Catholic organization funded in 2001 by Ignacio Arzuaga, a grassroots organization modeled on the religious right in the US, extremely well networked with international groups such as World Congress of Families. There's a lot of interesting work about Haste Oir. It's a kind of shady sect-like group. So they launched a campaign together, of which the most spectacular element were the so-called Stop Feminazi buses. You may have seen them. They were big buses with an unforgettable image of Hitler with lipstick on them. And the sign was said, "Stop feminazis. It is not gender violence. It is domestic violence." While the official aim of this campaign was supposedly for Haste Oir to appeal to Vox to make them repeal the so-called gender laws. In fact, of course, this was an instance of collaboration between Vox and Haste Oir to the benefit of Vox. In other words, it was actually an electoral campaign which claimed to be a civil society campaign. And it's interesting that gender violence was really the effective discourse here, just as LGBTQ rights were in Poland. In Hungary, my third example, and the most recent one, we're dealing with a referendum which coincided with parliamentary elections. I must say I gasped when I heard about it. The news came out after our book was published, and I really wished we could have included it. It was so in your face. The 4 questions asked in this referendum all concerned issues related to children's education in the matter of gender identity and sexuality. Voters were invited to state their support, if they support holding information events on sexual orientation to minors in public education institutions without parental consent. So you have the children threatened by sex education. The unrestricted exposure of minors to sexually explicit media content and showing minors media content on gender-changing procedures. Again, children threatened by either lewd imagery or sex change. And while the share of valid votes was below the required 50% threshold, actually the threshold was not the aim. The aim was to legitimize Orban and Fidesz more generally as the defender of children. And I think that has been, and well, we know that this has been a persistent strategy on the part of Orban. He had integrated anti-gender arguments into his political strategy, which he calls building an illiberal democracy. He had been a speaker at the World Congress of Families. Gender is a big part of the agenda, and this is the only case among the three where there is no accompanying organization. It's interesting that in Hungary, it's actually the government that's collaborating with itself in the struggle against gender. So what do these three examples tell us? They tell us that anti-gender rhetoric is used by populist actors strategically, persistently, and with both short-term and long-term goals. And as I said earlier, the short-term goals is to win elections. And when we studied the Polish anti-gender campaigns, there was a very interesting tendency for these campaigns to intensify before elections. And the longer-term goal is to situate themselves, the populist parties, as defenders of ordinary people who lead ordinary lives with ordinary gender roles, whereas they, that is the opposition, are equated with a perverse elite. And I guess that is really all I want to say in my introduction. What I would like us to do as part of our panel today is reverse the question. In other words, not just ask, what does gender do to populists, but also what does the concept of populism do for those of us who are interested in the struggle against gender? Is it the most useful frame, theoretically? What happens when you use the term populism to describe parties like Vox, Fidesz, Law and Justice, and many other parties you'll be speaking about? And what happens when you call them illiberal parties or radical right parties, or maybe increasingly in the last year or two, fascist parties in some cases? So we wrote our book, Anti-Gender Politics in the Populist Moment, with the frame populism, but we have since examined other possibilities, and we have been less shy about using the F word, and by F I mean fascism, at various meetings. So I guess I would like this conversation to go both ways. What does gender do for populists, and what does populism do for the scholars of anti-gender campaigns? And we will speak in the order introduced earlier by Ivan. Elżbieta Karolczuk is our first speaker with a theoretical framework explaining the relationship between populism and gender. Elżbieta, the floor is yours. You are muted, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, I am muted. After 2 years of using it, it's still the case. Okay, sorry for that. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I think that this is a conversation which really allows us to understand the sort of complex relationship between gender and, well, different types of ideologies and political practices. And I would like to defend, in a way, this conceptualization linking gender with populism, because I think that while some of the right-wing parties might be better described, that emerged as, important political players. I mean, they're hardly new, most of them. Like, for example, Sweden Democrats in the Swedish context. But they have emerged as players who have a quite important influence over the national politics and also over, for example, the EU politics. And I think that the main part of their appeal is the populist part of the appeal, not the extreme right, not the fascist undertone. And while the sort of level of populist rhetoric or populist politics differs from country to country, and the shape they take, both populist, both discourse and both rhetorics and policy proposals might be different. I think that what has brought the anti-gender movement to such a prominence, both discursive and political today, is the connection with populism, and especially the fact that they have, adopted or proposed a populist version of anti-gender rhetorics. So I would like to try to discuss this issue in a more theoretical frames, because, as you might know, the classic theoretizations or theories of populism, conceptualizations of populism, did not really pay attention to gender, and it doesn't really matter what type of definitions they would propose. And it's quite interesting that in a text which is from 2015, Kasmude and Rogira Kaltwasser, the sort of two big names in populist studies, have published an article which said that gender conceptually is not really important for studies of populism, and populism has no specific relationship to gender. And that, of course, connects with the fact that most of analysis were focused either on the, I would say, supply side or demand side, right? So there would be scholars who says that gender matters for the supply side, in a sense that charismatic leadership is often seen as an important element of populist politics. But of course, we have quite a few exemptions from this rule. Mr. Kaczyński, the head of the Polish Law and Justice being the really good example of truly uncharismatic populist leader. And of course, there will be those studies which show that gender matters for the demand side. And these would be studies such as the one by Spearsing and Zaslovek, who showed that there is a gender gap in voting for right-wing populist parties. But of course, the problem with this explanation is that, first of all, this gap has been closing in recent years. So women seem to be more prone to vote for right-wing parties. And also, most of those studies focus on radical right parties or extreme right-wing parties, not necessarily the type of populist right-wing mainstream parties, such as, for example, Law and Justice in Poland. So, in other words, we see that the situation is changing. And this map is sort of moving, the conceptual map. So we have to include those new phenomena, new trends to better understand what's happening. And I think that what is really interesting, the most interesting sort of conceptualizations of the relationship between gender and populism are nowadays produced or offered by scholars working within the scope of anti-genderism or anti-gender campaigns. So, for example, Dietze and Roth has proposed to see anti-gender or gender-oriented rhetorics as a way to sanitize extreme discourses, right? We can see it in many countries, especially in Western Europe, where open racism and homophobia are not very palatable in the public discourse in politics. So there are quite a few political actors who want to dress up as the protectors of, let's say, liberated women in Germany or in Sweden, who has to protect those women, our women, from migrants, from brown men who are positioned as racialized barbarians who do not know the rules of modern sexual freedom. Also, Julia Roth proposes to think in terms of patterns of engendering, right? For example, the engendering of others and ethnic scandals, as was the case with the Cologne events in Germany a couple of years ago. Also, she talks about issues such as gendering social inequalities, the ethno-sexist approach, and also something that we also discussed with Agnieszka, the notion, the frame of colonization by gender, which has been very popular, especially in countries which has this, I would say, ambivalent relationship with well, the West or Western Europe, such as Poland or Russia or other post-socialist countries or post-Soviet countries, where this notion of United Nations or European Union as those transnational institutions which impose specific rules and values hits a really important spot in the sense of being scolded and having to sort of live up to expectations of others. Also, a very interesting proposal of sort of conceptualizing this relationship has been offered by Birgit Sauer, who talks about right-wing populism as a project of masculinist identity politics. And I think that this connects to the discussions which show that actually the right wing has been much more effective in identity politics today, even though it is the left which is identified as such. And she shows how affects are connected here with the opposition to the process of commodification of everyday lives. So this is a way to connect the cultural and political aspects. And in a similar vein, Weronika Grzebalska and Andrea Petto proposed to look at the common roots of populism and anti-gender mobilization, which is neoliberalism, both in its economic form and also in its cultural dimension. And this is something that we also discussed in our book. I think that we really need conceptualizations which would, on the one hand, allow us to see the similarities between different contexts, because anti-gender movement is a transnational, a global movement, and there are a lot of connections between different countries and contexts. But at the same time, to be cautious of oversimplifications and to have this kind of dynamic and relational approach. And I hope that the notion of opportunistic synergy, which we propose with Agnieszka Graf in our book, might be a step in this direction, right? So we propose to look not necessarily at how populism is gendered, but rather what populism does, or what gender does to populism or to populist leaders, like how it is used, how it is used for building relationships, but also specific discursive narratives or discursive structures. And at the same time, we want to look at this sort of organizational and financial aspect of this relationship. So we look at both the ideological discursive and strategic organizational sides of this relation, right, of this process of cooperation between right-wing populists, political actors, and anti-gender movement or activists. And I think that an important element of this relationship is the fact that by adopting anti-gender rhetorics, right-wing populists are able to thicken the sort of thin ideological core of their rhetorics or their ideology. It really allows sort of this definition of who is the pervert and who is the sort of authentic traditional citizen or person who belongs to community. It is very much defined through the question of sexuality, through the question of morality. So basically, this allows, especially those populists who are in power, so who are elites themselves now, to show that there are still elites out there connected, for example, to EU, who are demoralizing our children, who are undermining the integrity of our nation. And that makes populism the effective politics that it is, right? So it really allows this process of moralization of politics that populists are so good at, and what Jan Werner Müller has included as an important definitional feature of populism. And finally, and this will be my final point, this also this sort of adoption of anti-gender or socially conservative rhetoric allows the populist leaders and parties to connect the culture, the social cultural with the economic. And this is something which we can see both in countries such as Poland or Hungary, but also in welfare state countries such as Sweden, where these right-wing actors position themselves as the protectors of the welfare provisions, both welfare provisions for children and families, which is of course in line with this idea of protection of traditional family, but also in the case of Sweden, for example, they, as Christian Rotzer, for example, have shown, they position themselves as those who protectors of the welfare state, of the folkhemmet that is being sort of taken away by liberals, by leftists, by feminists, by EU bureaucrats. So that is a proposition that I would like to put on the table, but I'm sure that we will have more ideas and more propositions during our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elżbieta. Our next speaker is Eric Louise Russell, who will speak about the language of reaction. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully this is visible. And thank you very much. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. It's quite early for me, so I hope you'll stick with me as I maybe fumble through this after only one cup of coffee. So I'm taking a very different look. I'm a linguist and a critical linguist. And by this, I'm referring to a certain type of intellectual engagement that is both a quintessential engagement, so a shared perspective and stance, looking at particularly linguistic materiality and discursive form, but also as a response to the linguistic community that's largely been very small and has ignored these human elements. So that is a background to what it is that I do, which is to look at language. Oops, I think this is on its own track now. Excuse me for that. Language as a vehicle of populism and as a site of populist action and reaction, as well as a site of, as an act and a domain of violation and violence. So that predicates everything I'll be saying in these few moments, and we'll be complementing, I believe, many of the other speakers and my colleagues, as well as perhaps providing a bit of a different perspective on that. I often refer to this as enlanguaging, which requires a different postural approach and a dependency. So in my understanding and the way I look at language, language is actually a verb. It doesn't exist in the way that we often think of it. And so what we are looking at is what speakers do when they do language, as well as what they do when they do ideology. And then the locus of this is actually on the languager themselves, right? And on their linguistic and discursive production and behavior. And then referring to these things as enlanguagements, so these pattern outputs, excuse me, of language or activity. Already from this level, and mine and several colleagues' work, we see several patterns of enlanguagement. Some of these are informal, and I give you a couple examples here. One is a distinction between in-group and out-group that is often borne out in phenomenal choices in languaging, and then the deixis that emerges from this. Other things sort of supersede this at a higher level, perhaps, if you think of it this way, and that's different structural patterns that are observed in languaging. So the different positioning via different patterns that different languaging behaviors afford. So for instance, the positioning of a populist hero, a party, a leader, and so forth, as well as their positioning vis-a-vis the real people or true people, as this has been referred to, and the antagonistic positioning of the true people vis-a-vis the other, the alloctinous other. This also bears out in semantics, as well as in different relational or in different functional patterning in languages. So we see time and again that enlanguaging makes real and realizes these sort of juxtapositions and oppositions that seem to lie at the heart of populism, at least as it's borne out in language. as well as in discourse practices. So just taking a step beyond how we often think of language, thinking a bit more about discourse, which might be referred to in a different way than some of our colleagues today, referring to these as practices, so materially manifested performances, which can be textual, particularly evident these days in multimodal discourses and discourse practices that we see in social media, for instance, as well as other media. And some of the threads that are seen in this that I've looked at in particularly a relatively recent book of mine is how the strong man of populism, and it is almost always a male, but there are some really interesting exceptions to this, is represented through discourse practices as a type of savior. Something that we've also heard about, the reframing of modernity as juxtaposed to this alloctonous other, which occurs in very interesting and complicated ways, in different patterns, in different spaces, in different language and contexts. The framing of the autochthonous is under threat. Several instances of table turning, retorsio argumentis, where the victim is then repositioned as the victimizer. So for instance, we see that LGBT groups, which we might think of as in a more traditional light, a non-populist light, as being victimized by different practices as actually being the victimizers in these cases, victimizers of others as well as victimizers of themselves. And then some really interesting and complex intersectionalities that occur with other hegemonic structures. For instance, gender itself, as we might refer to it as a social construct, sexuality, and so forth. Okay, one last sort of background before I get to 3 different examples, and this is the concept of enregistrement, which is the process by which different linguistic repertoires come to be associated culturally, internally with particular social practices. So the reliance on different enregistered forms, structures, semantic relationships, and so forth, which then will spread into the linguistic and discursive realm and move along them. And what we see in populism, because of course this is never static, it's actually quite dynamic and is ever hybridizing, is that it will move into other domains. And I think Susan Gull's work on this and gives us a heuristic that allows us to understand how this works, right? She refers to registers as clasping, relaying, and grafting. So clasping, linking into an area of social action, relaying, making connections across these different areas, and then grafting, implanting into a new arena, which superficially has opposing or contradictory meanings. And I think gender is a prime example of this. And we've already seen some really, really interesting examples of grafting as an output of how populism has managed to clasp and then relay. My colleagues, Rodrigo Borba and Domenica Baran, have actually referred to a lot of this in their own work. I'll be making some allusions to those as well. And these are what we might refer to as anti-gender linguistic and discursive registers, and how grafting has been the output of that. Okay, I want to move to 3 different examples, some of which come from my own research, some of which depend on the research of colleagues of mine. The first one comes from work that I've done on Philip de Winter and Vlaams Belang in Belgium, in Flemish Belgium. And what's really interesting, and one of the first takes I had of this was looking at his discourse and seeing this from an ecological point of view. And what I argue is that his populism relies on this sort of superficially pro-LGBTQ plus stance, but is ultimately homophobic in its affect, right? So it reinscribes LGBTQ plus persons as instruments of populism and is a liberalism, which can then be argued as actually having a type of table turning, which rearticulates them in a way that we might label as homophobic. Right? And this we can label as pinkwashing. We're increasingly seeing it labeled as rainbow washing to distinguish between other types of co-opting of discourses. In a later work, I take a discursive strategic approach to this and look specifically at how De Winter and others in his movement have actually re-articulated this as a means of Islamophobia. So this is another really interesting intersectionality that we see time and again in populism, where it's never just anti-genderism. It's never just anti-X or anti-Y. There's often a really complex dynamic that involves repositioning of different moral, different physical, different political participants in the discursive ecology. And there are lots and lots of other examples of this both in Europe and beyond. And I give a couple examples of those that we can see as well. I'm looking forward to some other presenters because I think this will maybe make an interesting connection. Okay, we've heard a lot about Poland today, but I think this is also something that can be very interesting to look at from a properly linguistic or discourse analytic perspective, right? And this is, again, the use of gender as sort of enregistrement of the idealized other, the idealized external element that puts the true or real people in threat, right? My colleague Dominika Baran, in her most recent work, as well as many that precede it, has looked at this as an example of how registers of nationalism, historical victimization have been clasped onto to re-articulate traditional, re-articulate different discourses and discursive formations of sex, personhood, and belonging to the Polish nation, and show that or argue that these are under threat. So this is again a case of populism moving into different domains and re-articulating them for different finalities, right? And this is actually, I think, one of the more dangerous examples that we see at present is coming out of Poland as well as some other countries, in part because, as this has been mentioned, this is not just coming from populist actors who are not in power, but one that is in power and has a tremendous amount of power. Though we also see other examples, for instance, in Croatia and Latvia, as well as contexts outside of Europe. I need to get back to my screen, excuse me. Another example I think is interesting in different ways, and this is from a forthcoming work that I have, looks at a really complex example of the enlanguagement of anti-gender forces in Italy at present. My work looked at this before the most recent elections in September that led to Meloni being the equivalent of prime minister. But the linguistic landscape surrounding political and non-political or quasi-political discussions of non-binarity and gender beyond traditional male-female binarity. And the populist reaction to this that led, for instance, to the non-passing of different law propositions that would have afforded some protection of this, as well as some presence of discussion of gender non-binarity in schooling in Italy and other sites. I argue that this is really a question of affability, that language, because it realizes our world, our ideational worlds, as well as our material worlds, the foreclosure of language and the foreclosure of possible language around this is actually a movement towards ineffability and exclusion and a type of symbolic and linguistic violence that's enacted, and that this is done through different populist mechanics as they play out in language. And some of this has to do with repositioning as center and periphery, the within, without, as well as the reinscription of anti-gender within feminist orders of discourse. In this really interesting and complex way, interesting and not in a positive, interesting sense, but interesting in the sense, in a way that I think also offers us a means of disruption. And I'll allude to that in just a few moments as well. But we also see similar things happening. We've seen this in France, for instance, or in French-speaking contexts, because in some of this is delocalized from particular state policies, because many of these are supranational languages. So French and Spanish are really interesting examples of this, how they do play out in different polities, but they also play out above polities and beyond them. So in French and Spanish, as well as in German, and some other examples that are much more tightly associated with a particular political statal space. And so the example of Czech, for instance. all of this also makes me want to turn some attention to the question of futurity, in part because I think we all spend a lot of time wrestling with these forces of illiberalism, of anti-modernity, of retrograde discourses. And sometimes we forget that we also need to keep an eye on futurity and the centrality of language in this. And that's in part because language is so central to populism. And so I would just like to open up a bit of space before I close down my own bit of talk here to allude to how we might think about disruption and to allude to the imaginary futurity of a better world. So queer utopianism always makes me think of this, as well as Jack Halberstam's work on queering and failure. And I think it's as important as it is to document what's happening, it's also important to imagine how we can step in and begin to break down these patterns. I'm, of course, always thinking of the language realm and how we can do this through languaging and languaging, but I think also in the visual space and political space and economic space is certainly a possibility. And I wanted to make certain that there was a time and a place in our discussion today for that, because I think it is very important. We stand in very privileged positions where we have the ability to come together and talk about this. And of course, there's a lot of important work to do to document what's happening on the populist side, but I think we also need to maybe consider anti-populism and anti-popular disruption in each of our domains. And so with that, I believe I actually managed to stick to my time. I'll stop sharing my screen and I will pass on to others. And I look forward to your questions and just a couple of acknowledgements as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Nick Lenders, PhD candidate at Radboud Social and Cultural Research for Gender and Diversity Studies, with the talk Gender and Sexuality in Dutch Populist Voter Profiles.
Thank you. I will also share my screen real quick. Okay. Thank you to all other speakers for their wonderful insights. And thanks for the organizers for having me. I feel very privileged to be part of this wonderful panel. My contribution today will be mostly focused on how the dynamics that we're talking about play out in the Dutch electorate. I will be predominantly talking about my most recent article, which I wrote together with my co-authors Niels Spierings and Stefan Duding, and which is currently in the review process. I will present some insights from my investigation into how the Dutch populist radical right electorate thinks about gender and sexuality related issues, as well as how they combine these attitudes with other attitudes that are often linked to populist radical right politics. And I think it's these combinations of preferences that I think are specifically interesting for our discussion here today, because similar constellations of attitudes may exist in other contexts as well, and may therefore provide new ways to look at and address how and when right-wing populism does or does not include certain specific parts or an anti-gender agenda. Maybe to start with then, some initial remarks about the Dutch case for those who may not be that familiar with this context. The first Dutch populist radical right politician that rose to popularity was Pim Fortuyn. Now, Fortuyn came into politics around the turn of the century, and he profiled very, very publicly as a gay politician. So he positioned himself as such to argue for his unique qualifications for leadership in that time period, presenting a sort of progressive radical right populism, so against sitting elites, immigration, but specifically Islam, and substantiated mostly from the conflation with Dutch identity with what he called sexual modernity, which is a very interesting framing considering Eric's talk, of course. Now, of course, there's much more to be said about Fortuyn and his legacy in Dutch politics, but suffice it to say for today's topic, the Dutch populist movement started in a way intertwined with a progressive outlook on gender and sexuality compared to the Dutch mainstream parties of the time, even though, of course, still somewhere on the spectrum of all of this, what we're talking about, right? And still problematic in its anti-immigration framing. Fortuyn was assassinated in 2002, but his name is still, 20 years later, often mentioned in the Dutch populist right. And all three parties that we identified for the study that I want to talk about here have proclaimed to be continuing Fortuyn's work in one capacity or another. This, combined with a generally rather progressive outlook on gender and sexuality in the Dutch mainstream as well, makes the Dutch case somewhat stand out from some other cases in which, as we have heard already, populist radical right politics is often associated more with conservative values in this regard. So fast forward to the 2021 elections, we have three populist radical right parties with varying ideas when it comes to gender and sexuality, PVV, FVD, and VIII. Now, from our previous study, which was published in Politics and Gender, and unfortunately without all the nuance that this overview actually deserves, PVV is the most progressive, although following what has been said, of course, we can address whether this is superficial or whether this is a matter of gradation, so where the anti-gender actually starts. We can talk about that. But we find that the PVV is rather consistently supportive of gay and lesbian rights, even outside of discussions about Islam or immigration. They are also tentatively supportive of trans rights, at least discursively, as long as, and again, coming back to what has been said, it's not taught to children. So there's a line for them as well. And this is something that we can also talk about. But then non-binarity is where they drop off. Then FVD is mostly conservative on gender and sexuality issues, as became very clear, for example, in their sarcastic campaign last year, which read, "How many genders do you have today?" Publicly, however, they do position as being pro-gay rights, but from some incidental discursive transgressions, this is not always so clearly actually the case. VIII is a split off from FVD, and they do not profile or often speak publicly on gender and sexuality related issues, but we did find that when they do address them, they seem at least more progressive than FVD. So in a nutshell, that is how the parties position themselves. But we wanted to compare this with the preferences of the part of the Dutch electorate that they actually cater to. For the current study then, we used nationally representative survey data. I see there's something in the chat actually. I don't know if that's relevant for now, but yeah, for the current study, I can't see where the chat is actually. Oh, okay. Okay, so for the current study, we used nationally representative survey data from the Dutch parliamentary election study. And using latent class analysis, we identified different voter profiles within the populist radical right electorate in the Dutch electorate. And we selected not just the respondents who said to actually vote for one of the three populist parties, but also those who responded to seriously contemplate voting for them. And we did this because those who move back and forth between the PRR and more centrist parties are a large portion of the actual PRR vote in any given election, regardless of how they voted this one time. So in terms of mapping populism, understanding the positions will help us further understand the electoral appeal of these parties, right? So moving to what we actually found in the study, we used a data set that has very interesting topical issues on gender and sexuality. The first item that they include is a measure of whether the respondent supports adoption by same-sex couples. The second they include is a support for sex change operations. And the third is whether the respondent finds that there's something wrong with people who feel neither man nor woman. And these are also the items that are currently the pivot points in the Dutch political debate. And studies show that in this context, they also seem like very good proxies for measuring support for gender equality itself. We then added other issues that are usually thought to appeal to populist radical right voters. So they encompass populism, nationalism, ethno-nativism, colonialism, anti-Islam and anti-refugee sentiment, as well as support for religion in politics, strong leadership, and the EU. Most of these are rather straightforward, and I won't go into detail for that reason and for time constraints, but one distinction merits some explanation here, and it has to do with the concept of nationalism and nativism. So nativism is an umbrella term that is often used in academic work and often considered pivotal to voting for the PRR, the populist radical right. But because of its etymological relation to nativity, I feel its full conflation with nationalism is somewhat problematic and often goes uninvestigated. And our theoretical framework actually suggests that this distinction is important. So we distinguished between nationalism and ethno-nativism. And in this distinction, nationalists are those who believe anyone could in theory ascend to national identity if they just adapt enough to the populists' idea of national hegemony. In other words, anyone who can learn Dutch and adopt Dutch customs may, again in theory, become part of what they see as the legitimate body politic. In contrast, although nationalism still puts specific minorities at a considerable disadvantage, of course, ethno-nativism goes beyond this. To those with strong ethno-nativist beliefs, in the Dutch context, only those born in the Netherlands from Dutch parents can become part of the legitimate citizenry. I think you can already see how gender and sexuality come in there, and I will come back to this. But I will move on to discussing the profiles that we found. So these 5 profiles that we found, I've listed on this sheet here. But rather than discuss them one by one, which you could read at length once the paper is published, I thought it would be more interesting for our discussion here to discuss what the insights are that we've gained from looking at these in detail. And I want to start with the observation that in the Dutch electorate, there's only 9% of the voters that even consider voting for this party family that are truly gender conservative. There's also been no concrete evidence that we could find that this sentiment is on the rise in the Netherlands, but there is research indicating that people who identify either as non-cis or non-heterosexual feel increasingly unsafe. So perhaps if it is indeed not increasing percentage-wise, this sentiment at least grows more vocal, more violent, or more polarized. This brings me then to what differentiates progressive and moderately progressive PRR voters, who make up more than half of our sample, from the truly conservative PRR voters. And there are 3 topics here that stand out and that may warrant further qualitative inquiry also in other contexts, and I hope we can talk about these things here. The first thing that we find is that there seems to be an overlap between conservative or orthodox religiosity, and particularly Christianity, and the more gender conservative outlook. So for example, we found that SGP, the Dutch Orthodox Protestant Party, is relatively popular only in the small gender conservative group. Others have also noticed this intersection, and for example, you could see Philip Korsky's book, The Flag and the Cross, for a discussion about this in the American context, in the US context. Second, while most of the profiles consist of around 60% men, matching the idea still of populist parties as men's parties, but indeed the gap is closing, right? The most progressive group actually consists of 55% women. So the group that is most gender progressive is majority women, actually. And the gender conservative group is around 73% men. So also unsurprisingly, none of the non-cis or non-heterosexual voters that there are a couple that within the PRR electorate that we found, none of them are in the gender conservative group, and all of them are either in the modern or moderate group. This all goes to show that while the PRR may not or may no longer be completely determined men only, the anti-gender sentiment does remain linked closely with an overrepresentation of men and masculinity, which is something that we, I think, need to address. Third, and finally, I come back to the fight between ethno-nativism and nationalism that I made. Because while all of the groups consistently show a highly nationalist sentiment, only the truly gender conservative group, as well as the group that is inconclusive or divided on these gender and sexuality attitude items, are also highly ethno-nativist. So this tells us that those with gender progressive values place less stringent demands on what nationality means to them. And gender essentialism, which could perhaps be associated with the ideas about the traditional family, also linked to the religious link that we found, closely aligns also more with nativist ideas about citizenship, as well as what the country should look like to them, right? So there's much more to be said on all these topics, and I hope these first sort of ideas provide some insights to further think through. But bringing these observations together, then, I think one of the questions Agnieszka also asked us to reflect on is how anti-gender sentiment actually relates to populism. Elżbieta also, of course, reflected a lot on this. And my studies in the Dutch context, I think, show that there is indeed this sort of gradation in terms of where these parties, but also the electorate, sort of hop on and off on this anti-gender sort of discourse. But I don't mean to gloss over the very real possibility that populist leaders may instill in their voters a conservative outlook. I want to add that sometimes maybe gender and sexuality just share the same affective connotations, also, of course, following Sauer, that populism has managed to instill about nationhood and ethnicity. Thus, these issues too can become one of the topics that populists use to rile up their base, along with their nationalism and anti-elitism. And then perhaps how they do so and which position they take may indeed depend on the context, as well as the hegemonic beliefs about these topics in their nation of operation, as well as which part of the electorate they actually come from or cater to. So thank you. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Dr. Pauline Cullen, and she will be speaking about feminist responses to right-wing populism and its take on gender.
I'm trying to get to slide to the slide view. Oh, folks, the little bar is in my way here. So I think everyone can see it there. Thanks very much, everyone, for inviting me and including me today. This talk really reflects research I completed for a special issue of the journal European Politics and Society back in 2021 on the populist turn in EU politics and the response of civil society organizations. And a central question of the special issue was, how has a change in politics, particularly the rise of populism, affected political opportunities for civil society organizations in the EU? The case I used to respond to that question was that of the EU feminist civil society organization, the European Women's Lobby, which is transnational in scope, located in Brussels, funded by the EU, and really epitomizes the elite EU technocrat that make it a target of right-wing populist anti-gender equality forces. Some of the research questions that I posed in that piece, and were posed more broadly in the special issue, was what was the role of the EU political opportunity context in shaping the European Women's Lobby's response? What venues and strategies have this particular feminist civil society organization used to highlight right-wing populist threats? What discursive strategies had been used to address right-wing populist discourse, and in what ways did the European Women's Lobby in particular address forms of what I refer to as frame co-optation? What did their particular response make possible or exclude? And what can this case, I think, more broadly tell us about transnational dissemination of anti-feminist discourse and activism? So the main argument of the piece was that feminist opposition to anti-gender equality interests and ideas are complicated by how right-wing populists have co-opted constructions of gender justice and the proximity between right-wing populist ideas and feminist critiques of economic governance, austerity, and European integration. Some of the findings included that the European Women's Lobby works to counter right-wing populist frameworks, but they are tied to EU imperatives and they're weakened by multiple crises and a neglect of gender justice at EU level. And that right-wing populist ideas, actors and institutions that used gender to do political work have benefited from the absence of a strong political commitment to gender equality at EU level, and also neoliberalized instrumentalization of gender equality, which has created opportunities for centre-right radical flank tactics on the issue of gender equality. So what do we know about this changing opportunity context at European level? Well, we know that European integration itself is best understood, particularly from a sociological perspective, as kind of a relational ecosystem of organized civil society groups. And these have particularly prospered from the opportunities that European integration has provided. Financial and ideational support, particularly from the European Commission, has allowed some of these organizations to become agents of policy integration and the dissemination of EU policy ideas, especially in areas that include gender equality. Women and feminist organizations working at EU level had gained a certain foothold and influence. This has waned in recent years in particular, and it has created a situation where they have access at times rather than influence. But this has always been an elite game, of course, and the most intersectional or diverse NGOs have the least access in this space. Populist forces then have also created, has been well documented by the work of our other panelists, a very adverse landscape for rights-based European civil society groups. And this reflects developments that are well documented in national contexts. What we then see is a more crowded space with conservative right-wing competitors working at EU level insinuated across the European institutions, less institutional support for civil society, more progressive civil society agents, and then European civil society groups themselves shifting strategies and looking at different venues. How have they responded? Well, they have tried to respond, I suppose, in a variety of ways, drawing on some of the social movements literature, and this again has been well documented by the feminist scholars working on populism. We've had a range of responses that include adaptation, exit, abeyance, either professionalization or radicalization, adopting new managerial and communication techniques. But across the civil society community, and this is established, I think, particularly well on the special issue, we do see some common frameworks, some efforts to maintain some strategic differentiation related to the focus of a particular civil society group, sometimes the use of emotion, sometimes transnational strategies, but also that there's a particular challenge here that in engaging on the issue, civil society groups working at the level of the EU have to avoid the re-amplification of particular right-wing and, in the case that I look at, anti-feminist frames, while maintaining a focus on equality and democracy. And more recently, we've seen in the work of some folks an avoidance of conflict, and move away from a direct confrontation with right-wing populist ideas, less front stage work, more backstage and informal efforts to influence and support other leftist actors in the struggle against right-wing populist forces. Now, I won't go into this. This has also been well rehearsed in a variety of studies at the European level that's looked at the particular opportunity context on gender equality, the retreat of the European Commission, the shifting of gender equality politics to a low politics status, the decline of the kind of velvet triangle of feminist critical actors. And we now have great advantage because we have the work of scholars that are looking at resistances to gender equality in very indirect ways, but also in more direct ways, but particularly understood through the prism of multiple crises. and the weakening of the feminist response and the compromise of that response over time, at the same time as the work of our other panelists here on democratization, at the same time as gender equality becomes politicized, and how this complicates the terrain for a feminist response. We also have literature that's tried to help us better understand the relationship between feminisms in the field of populism. So lots of really good work that's looked at how this is playing out at the national context and the regional context. And here we have theoretical work that's tried to parse out the relationship between feminism and the left, but also work that gives us a better understanding perhaps of what the other folks today have talked about, this very contextual reality of populism, at the same time as this overarching tent, if you like, that many of the right-wing populist forces perhaps can be gathered under, but also in some sense the gradational qualities of populism and how that can complicate the response. At the same time as really rejecting in many ways this backlash narrative and appreciating the long arc of these processes over time that has become part of the institutional fabric. And this relates a little bit to the last couple of speakers, particularly the relationship between social conservatism, gendered nationalism, and how these perpetuate existing patriarchal power relations through the design of seemingly and supposedly reformist agendas and policies that target women's equality issues, but at the same time reinstitute clientelism, paternalism, nativism, and forms of welfare chauvinism. All bad news for feminist actors interested in gender justice. The challenge for European civil society groups are when they align themselves with supposed EU values, which are obviously technocratic and for many of us insufficiently redistributive, and how this, we have long understood about the human rights mythology of the EU and how this is complicated, particularly when we think about narratives of European integration. So I view social movement analysis here in the article that I wrote a couple of years ago to make sense of this. And I make a very simple, I suppose, point that in some sense, EU feminist civil society groups shared a reference point, particularly that period of time, in their critique of the European project as undemocratic, disconnected from the realities of European women's lives, and wedded to austerity. And that challenged the European Women's Lobby to calibrate frameworks that remained reflexive on the limits of European integration for gender equality, yet avoided alignment with right-wing populist constructs of Euroscepticism in particular. And I asked the question of what they did, and I documented over a period of time how they negatively constructed their adversaries using vilification initially, debunking of some of the right-wing populist frameworks, and then also laterally a form of frame saving, trying to simultaneously preserve their own frames for their own constituents and align their claims, particularly with their supporters and their institutional targets at the EU level. Now, I won't get you to look at all of this. This was an effort. It's in the published article that's available. But there was an effort to try and make a distinction, a strategic differentiation between the frameworks used. This, I think, focus a little bit on what Eric was talking about this turning the tables. And this is an example of turning the tables, trying to resuscitate, recuperate ideas, frameworks, language, if you like, that right-wing populists had co-opted, that feminists had long considered they're preserved. Of course, this is a long-term project that goes back many decades, but in this particular moment, I followed the process between about 2014 to 2020, 2021 of how the Women's Lobby was waking up to this reality, came out in a very reactive way at the beginning, was only looking at Central and Eastern Europe in a very othering way in terms of whether this is going on. And by 2019, 2020, was recognizing right-wing populism as an internal threat to the European institutions and to the European continent itself, and the shift in their frames over time. But I won't rehearse that particular empirical argument. So in a nutshell, what I argued was that using these particular framing techniques and counter-framing techniques, they were aiming to repoliticize gender equality, particularly as an EU ideal. And feminism as a project for the common good, recuperating what they, and we would still suggest, is a stagnant policy context on gender equality. This is directed to EU elites. It's not directed towards right-wing populist forces, but particularly trying to make that connection between liberal threats to gender equality being emblematic of a deeper crisis facing European democracies, and as such reserving a robust and well-resourced defence, and that the preservation and deepening of gender equality is the front on which the battle for Europe's future should be fought. And this, of course, creates an opportunity for them discursively, particularly to underline their relevance as an actor at European level. The conclusion in the article was that resistances to gender equality, particularly, are visible, obviously, in extreme right oppositions, but these prosper from how more centrist forces have neglected gender equality projects. And there is a radical flank effect here, particularly for those looking for cover, but eager to stall progress on gender justice. But that EU feminist organisations and their professionalisation, their adherence to aspects of EU discourse and a reliance on EU funding, including those linked to instrumental uses of gender, create additional risks that weaken feminist argumentation for gender justice and a capacity to offer an opposition to right-wing populism. This is just an effort to capture some of the current terrain of feminist responses, and you have everything here from German think tanks to the European Institute for Gender Equality in Vilnius, to the European Feminist Platform, to the European Network of Migrant Women. And I just want to finish in the last couple of moments talking about more current developments and what I refer to as Feminist Europe 2.0. And this just gives us a sense really of what's going on in the space, and particularly the European Women's Lobby. You see here a screenshot from a European Institute for Gender Equality, European Women's Lobby panel entitled Resisting the Backlash. And I'm posing the question about what the feminist response is or could be or should be. We see they're still drawing on this backlash narrative. Is it less reactive? I'm not sure. We do see the same kinds of asks or demands of the European system, looking for ratification of conventions, directives on violence against women. Obviously, the strong influence of the Swedish women's lobby around the abolitionist perspective of prostitution as violence against women. But then looking for an EU Commissioner on gender equality, looking to beef up the machinery of the European Union and its competencies around gender equality issues as a defence against these external threats or backlash. As being that it's referred to. And then we also have the intellectual space, feminist knowledge production, filling the data gaps. You know, is there a possibility here with all of the things we have going on that there's a possibility to seed alternative knowledge as an opposition to right-wing populism? And we have a lot of expertise here. We've EGA generating forms of equality data where there are gaps in unpaid care, going back to the social conservatism around the care issue, around masculinity, around positive masculinity, around gender norms, bringing it back into the center space of central questions around gender inequality in everyday life. And then we have our feminist critical friends and that particular kind of influence, particularly around COVID-19 and asking big questions related to Eric's challenge to us around a feminist imaginary, a futurist kind of idea around where we could go. And then we have what's actually going on in the academic space, the diffusion of feminist critique, and we have the ERC, Jean Monnet and Horizon projects, which I know some of our panelists are involved with here as well. And then we have also the left-wing feminist think tanks and processes like the Conference on the Future of Europe. And at the very bottom here, sadly, in terms of public power as well and hierarchy, we have, of course, a proliferation of grassroots feminist collectives that are deeply anti-racist, can be involved in mutual aid and prefigurative politics and offer exciting opportunities. The risk, of course, is that the language that's the new forms of knowledge perhaps that being generated could also end up being co-opted in many ways. And there are other actors and venues also. The European Parliament's been well documented in the EU Agenda project as offering opportunities, but also very contested and conflictual space around gender equality and right-wing populism. We have the citizens' initiatives, but of course they're also used by the right wing. The Conference on the Future of Europe has been assessed as deeply gender unequal and unsatisfactory in how it represented gender equality issues. Citizens' panels have been suggested as an important way that the Commission is now going to respond to the initiation of proposals. They have failed generally to create, I would say, genuine deliberation across European societies. Some people have argued for an EU Council on gender equality to centre the issue, to mount this defence. There may be opportunities for the kinds of alliance building or new narrative networks or forms of communicative power that come cross-sectorally, maybe working with trade unions or feminized occupations. Finally, and this goes to, I guess, what Eric was talking about a little bit, and that is this notion of a feminist political imaginary that can contest this populist political grammar, this elephant in every room, essentially. And I've just a number of questions to pose as I finish. Where is right-wing populism best resisted? Is it transnational? Is it national? Is it the local level? Do universal frameworks, including human rights or gender equality, really hold any potential? What's the role of situated knowledge in addressing these multiple crises? And what then again about the affective, the futurist appeal here? What are the implications also of aligning with supposed EU narratives of European integration that can be deeply problematic? And then can we, center in the debate around our response the recognition of this mainstream institutional racism and sexism that is a fabric of liberal democracies, and that tends to sometimes displace far-out ideas onto working class and in particular poor communities, and that creates these opportunities for these radical flank effects that maybe were captured a little bit in our last speaker's data on electoral support for various issues in that sense. And then, when we think about fighting, in some sense, right-wing populism, particularly at the EU level, it may be warranted, and maybe that is the level at which we should be thinking about resistances and strategies, but there's something obviously deeply difficult and problematic about the European civil society level space. It's distance from these local forms of contact or high energy democracy, and obviously, the kind of more intersectional and anti-racist feminist spaces that have actually seemed the most resistant to and insulated from frame cooptation of a populist kind for obvious reasons. So I finished there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers for also for keeping to time. This way we still have some time for questions, both from the audience and maybe from each other. I'd like to open up a space for discussion. Okay, well, to get us going, I guess I have a question for Eric. I was very intrigued by your approach. I used to study linguistics. It's been a while, but your talk confirmed my hunch that anti-gender discourse is not a set of arguments, but rather a cultural and linguistic practice. And I guess my question is, which of the various strategies do you think is most effective and most worth looking at of the what you call languaging? I mentioned at the very beginning the astonishing success with which this movement actually resignified the word gender, which I guess would be placed right in your semantics section, but there are so many others. So my question is, what's your favorite?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult question to answer, because favorite means the one I think is probably the most effective on the right-wing populist side, right? So it's the one that we need to be most careful to pay attention to. I don't know if I can answer that. I think because I approach this as a linguist who came up in first of all, in the European school of linguistics that is, looking very much at language as something that exists, which is not necessarily something I would maintain anymore. But taking an emic perspective of this, I think in a way we do ourselves injustice by assuming that everything will be the same from place to place, from lingua cultural context to lingua cultural context. And I think Nick's talk is really important for that, because you see things like, what is progressivism? As a linguist, it's completely unshocking to me that resignification would happen, that there would be different signification of a signifier from context to context, even within, a bounded lingua cultural community. So I think we just need to be a bit cautious about that. We need to always operate from within. It's very easy to operate from without, particularly as this concerns languages, right? So I'm not sure I can answer that. I can say that it is important to perhaps co-opt some of the strategies that right-wing populists use themselves, which is identifying particular signifiers that are perhaps open to resignification and and to hybridization, so to use them in different ways. And I think the example in Poland is really an excellent one, as much as I understand it, which is re-signifying what sexuality does in a lingua cultural context, which is now it seems to have a very strong connotation with non-Polishness, according to my colleagues who work in that. And I think if we can do the same thing, we can maybe re-signify some of the linguistic and languaging weapons that are being used by illiberal forces. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but hopefully it attends to it a bit. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. There's a question from Ivan. Would you like to just speak up, or would you like me to read it?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I was just
Please
writing.
go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It's been very, very inspiring and insightful. So my question is to Dr. Russell. I'm interested in the use of language and rhetoric by radical populist actors. So to what extent the use of radical rhetoric and language by populist actors to ideologize the other through gender, as you have mentioned, can lead to the radicalization of the population and to encourage normal people, normal citizens, average citizens, to act violently against other genders? Thank you very much.
I think in this is a case of all that's new is old, all that's old is new. We've seen this time and time again in the European context, but not only, where the other is ideologically constructed, I would say, in language, so made real through linguistic practice, and not only, of course, linguistic practice, but that's what I look at. And then because of that, they are then rendered a subject of potential violence, which is not considered to be necessarily violence. It is then somehow legitimized as just the natural product of law and order, of a Rechtsstaat, of a society that functions in a certain way. And we see this time and time and time again. And what's fascinating and also very, very disturbing for me, both as a linguist and as a human, is how this plays out in this sort of really low-level granularity of language. So it plays out in, for instance, the choice of pronominal constructions. And we'll see that where there's this approximation and distillation that can play. And it's very evident if you have enough of a body of data to see that. To make a direct correlation between specific acts of violence, I think that's something that I don't feel I have the expertise on, but it doesn't take a lot to say that there is a correlation between that, right, as it's happening. And that's just one domain of language, one relatively sort of easy to see. These questions of semantics and verbal semantics and positioning and projection are actually much, much more complex. But we see this time and time again: construct the other, remove the other, and then the other actually is removed from even another type of semantic, which is like, what is civil, what is expected, what is okay, what is not okay, what is authorized, what is not authorized, what is even considered violence in the first place.
If I may pitch in here, we actually examined one such case where incitement to violence was very clearly successful, and that was the anti-LGBTQ campaign, which I actually mentioned, and the July 2019 march in Białystok, which turned into basically a violent encounter that was compared to pogroms. I was there, and the violence was quite real, and echoing earlier media statements. Any questions from the audience? Go ahead.
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes, I have a question. Having in mind the political populist leaders and how they behave vis-a-vis the gender issue, I wonder if there is a difference between the leaders that are male and leaders that are females. I mean, the women. Is there a difference with the behavior of men and women when elites and leaders treat this issue? The question is general. I mean, I don't address it to anybody, to any specific person. If anybody can answer it.
I can try.
I
I haven't been studying this in particularly, I mean, in details, but when I look at the Italian context, I think it's really interesting. And a difference between Salvini, for example, and the current political leader, right? So I think that this really shows that, of course, that would be depending on the context, right? And the political culture in a specific country. But I feel like there is a level of legitimization that is afforded by female leaders who sort of play with gender stereotypes, and at the same time, such as Giorgia Meloni, for example, use her position as a sort of young, attractive woman who is in the higher echelons of power, to claim that actually this is not anti-women politics, right? That this is a type of politics which actually provides opportunities for women. And that sort of echoes what Pauline Cullen was saying, that it's very difficult to have a good strategy to counteract this kind of performances, political performances, and this kind of rhetoric, right? Because of course it is very easy to fall into the trap of, assuming that women such as Giorgia Meloni herself, but especially women who support her politics, are suffering from, I don't know, false consciousness syndrome, or that they are doing things which are counterproductive for women at large. So I think that this is, in a way, it's a very good strategic move, I would say, for right-wing parties to promote women both as speakers, as potential leaders, which doesn't happen that often, right? But it happens increasingly in Europe, in France, and Denmark, I think, is another example. So in that sense, I think that we will see more of this type of legitimization of right-wing politics by women, right? And that might be quite effective with women voters, especially if we compare them with this kind of macho figures such as Salvini, right? Or Kaczynski, who is not macho figure, but who is clearly not in tune with especially young female voters.
Thank you. Thank you.
Eric, go ahead, please.
I might just add to that an interesting wrinkle is one that Nick alluded to with VIII, which is the not just on a traditional women-man, but also normatively male, non-normatively male, one dimension of which is sexuality. And so we've seen not just in the Netherlands, but elsewhere, where there are participants who are LGBT, maybe we might not get down the alphabet yet, just LG, right, and LGB, because of the ways that has been hybridized into this understanding of what is allowed in the us, right, and in a certain way. So I think I like this question because I think it allows us an entry into just how progressivism is so dynamic, populism is so dynamic, and plays out very, very differently.
Bulent, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for these great presentations and interesting discussions. I have actually a few questions that I couldn't understand the reason, especially from the demand side. I mean, the women segment of the societies in both Europe and the Americas. We know that women has a role in some radical right parties, as you mentioned, as leadership level, but also as a supporter, both in SD, in Serious Democratarna. And we know that the masculinist macho leaders take some support from big segments of the women in, for instance, Philippines, Duterte, a real misogynist and a real macho leader, Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, and even some white supremacist organization like Proud Boys and alt-right groups take some support from women, and they don't hesitate to call themselves, as the case of Proud Boys, the Proud Boys girls. They define themselves and they positioned with the position of the macho white supremacist guys, you know. So how could you assess this demand of women for macho leadership or macho discourse? How could find they a place in this framework? My question is to anybody who could give answer.
I'll just talk because I haven't said anything.
Thank you.
I would say, I mean, I haven't done much research to this in particular, but I mean, I think it is very complicated. I think there are class anxieties here. In the American context, there is some evidence to suggest that in the Trump context, particularly, there were a lot of women who were very concerned about their own sons and their own male relatives being accused falsely of rape or of, it is a complex scenario. It is what I would call the Goldilocks version of gender equality. So for mainstream, sadly, we know all about the complicity of women in patriarchy, but there's been just enough, and any more is too much. So this notion that the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction, where young men's rights are being undermined, where young men are being threatened particularly, and their reputations are being ruined. This was definitely an instinct, I think, and I think some of the gender and politics scholars in the US, looking particularly at the way in which so many white women voted for Trump, would probably verify that particular analysis. It is contextual. I mean, in the Irish context, it is very complex. You have a lot of class and status anxiety around the school system. If you remove the church and faith-based control from the school system, the quality of education may deteriorate. If you improve education on sexuality and relationships, if you push very progressive education around sexuality into schools, other kinds of objectives might be untied, undermined, and you have very middle class, somewhat kind of middle of the road, centre-right people who are nervous about transgender rights, who are nervous about women's liberation again becoming too strong or too pervasive. And this we see then is reflected with policymakers who are resistant to gender mainstreaming or gender impact assessment, that things have gone too far. And so it is complex. So it is not necessarily, I think we have, the images of lots of, sadly, lots of usually white American women enraptured by Trump or whatever. But the reality is, I think, much more complex. It is wrapped up in other people's anxieties, and this is what populism is very good at doing. I mean, the Scottish recognition bill at the moment in the United Kingdom is really interesting. Here we have a piece of legislation that the Scottish Parliament has voted on to recognise, allow trans people to select their own identity through certification. The left, centre-left, are supporting it really as a way of asserting the rights of Scotland for their own national identity and separation from the rest of the United Kingdom. So they're using gender identity and trans people's rights to an extent for another goal. And the Tory government has blocked this bill, not because they say they're anti-trans or that things have gone too far, but rather because they say, obviously, that Westminster needs to maintain control over Scotland and to reduce the capacity of the Scottish people to declare a referendum for independence. So there you have an issue again around women's rights, women identified people's rights, sexuality is getting all tied up and tangled up with a project around Scottish nationalism, the Tories trying to assert their control over domestic agenda, but using the issue of generally kind of middle of the road people who have slight discomfort, ambivalence maybe about transgender identity or gender identification, just stoking it enough to maintain their control and to politicize them. It's something that both Agnesia and Elizabeth both said, and that is about getting the vote out. It's about mobilizing people in that way. So I know I've talked too long, but that's how I see it. It's very complex and it's multifactorial.
Thank you so much for adding that complexity. I would add to it a theme that has been present in anti-gender discourse from its beginnings in the 90s, which is the idea that feminism is a threat to motherhood. I think there's a very strong investment in, traditional motherhood and the idea that feminism is anti-mother, and of course that LGBTQ rights are a threat to children. So that's one way that women enter into it with a mission. Is there a question coming from the audience? If not, I actually have one for Nick concerning the Dutch context. You said at one point that the non-binary is where they drop off, discussing one of the parties. And my question is, and it's to you, but also maybe to others, what happened to good old homophobia? As an Americanist, I often see echoes in these campaigns and in these strategies of 1970s homophobic campaigns from the United States. I mean, that's how Reagan got into power, through through blowing oxygen into the moral panics that had been incited by the religious right from the mid-70s on. And obviously, you can't do it quite the same way nowadays, with most of the population being convinced that gay marriage is fine and actually contributes to family stability. But Elżbieta and I come from a context where good old homophobia is still, alive and kicking. But I wonder if we are the only place in Europe where that's done, and whether non-binary is where they drop off everywhere else. So Nick and maybe others as well. In other words, what's the frontier now? Is it really non-binary and trans?
So thanks for that question, because I think that's a very interesting way of framing this development. And I would actually, I think I would argue that, again, this is context dependent, right? And in the Dutch context, there are actually two drop-off points at the current stage in our populist radical right discourse. There's the PVV dropping off point, where either it's about we leave the children alone, or it's about the non-binarity part of it. So, for example, there was this campaign by primary schools where they educated children about queer identity and various self-identification, sexual identity markers, and Wilders, who is the political leader of the PVV, the party where I said the non-binarity is where they drop off. He ranted in the national parliament about, look, it's fine to me when people want to change their sex. I don't mind, basically. Like that's sort of a literal quote that's what he said in the parliament. But then he added, like, why do we need to teach our children about this stuff, right? So this also goes back to Elżbieta, what Elżbieta said about, there is a danger to our children, right? The other thing that it made me think of is that at some point, the National Railway in the Dutch context announced that they would stop saying "ladies and gentlemen," and instead they would replace it with "dear travelers." And then they sort of lost it basically, and they said, well, the Dutch railway has lost its mind, and this is what amounts to a woke dictatorship, basically. So that's the PVV, right? And then there's the FVD, which is much more on the classical sort of anti-gender spectrum. Although, as I said, like publicly, they say that they are pro-gay rights, and they sort of consistently say that. So it's not good old homophobia, right? But at the same time, there's numerous instances where they discursively transgress this threshold, and where they, for example, on the campaign trail, their leader at one point said that we shouldn't, in terms of the nostalgic view that they have of the Dutch history, and that's all being taken away, right, by woke people and feminists, and in that context, he brought up, well, we shouldn't be teaching our children books like Pete is gay and he's bullied for it, and instead we should be teaching them about the good old days of the Dutch conquests, basically, right, like the heroic stories of the Dutch past. So there's a binary there, right? There's a nostalgic vision of the past that they want to use to replace sort of the more modern progressive outlook. So it's not quite good old homophobia, but it comes close. And these are coexistent in one context. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm completely answering your question, but I think these are interesting things to think through, because yeah, even within one context, yeah, the barrier is in different places.
Yeah, thank you. We actually encountered, while we were researching the different versions of anti-genderism, a very interesting case in Germany where there were prominent gay figures in the AfD, including at one point a lesbian leader. And the drop-off point was politicizing your gay identity. In other words, it was okay to be gay as long as you didn't make it into the gay agenda. And, you know, so sexual orientation was up to you, but once it was politicized, then it counted as gender, and gender is evil. And in Poland, you know, it's enough to be pro-choice and you are already a genderist. So I think the drop-off point is quite at different places. Bulent, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to seek for an answer for a question that I couldn't understand good. Especially in Dutch case, you know, we know that the populist radical right movements and far right movements generally racist, fascist, and in Hungarian case, as you some of you mentioned, illiberal. But in Dutch case, sometimes this populism, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, sometimes anti whatever the other, you know, anti-other rhetorics and politics is based on including these LGBTQ plus groups. And they attend in these political parties and groups to otherize the others. How could we explain this, whether there is a role for this attitude for civilizationalism, the Western civilization, protecting liberal values? To protect liberal values, sometimes the groups may act in opposite way to exclude and otherize others, you know, some others. Maybe Nick, maybe other, maybe Eric could answer. I don't know.
I mean, I can just jump in and say that it's. I think we might. This is one of the traps, I think, of language, that we assume that these signifiers have fixed points, and that we sometimes ignore that their eternal dynamic nature, right? Like things are always changing, and also sometimes we give them a bit too much power, perhaps, by assuming that people are, for instance, only their gender, or only their sex, or only their sexuality, or only their nationality, or only their X, Y, Z, and so forth. You know, I think this speaks to many of the questions we have, like how can, you know, the question of how can there be women and the right-wing populist movement when it seems to be so anti-feminist? And that may be because people consider what feminism is to be different, and what it means to be female to be different, what it means to be gay, what it means to be civilized even. I see co-opting of what civilization is and what it means to enact civilization through policy, through economic action and so forth, is not static, and it's not uniform even within one space. People have conflicting feelings and interests and imperatives that they're contending with. And I think just having, as a linguist, I keep coming back to that, like it's unshocking to me but it can be kind of surprising in how it's interpolated. And so I think that lies at a lot of my answer to some of these questions of how can there be. There always have been. I mean, if we think about the history of Europe and its many, many dark moments, some of the early, I'm thinking, for instance, in the Italian political context, some of the earliest fascists were Jewish. And so we can ask the question, how could that be? And that's perhaps because that wasn't the most important part of their identity. And even the way they understood that identity was not necessarily the way that we have come to understand it now in a post hoc manner. And that should maybe give us a bit of stand back and humility vis-a-vis the way we put this into action. We're actually complex assemblages of many identities, to quote from Plar. So I'll leave it there because I have a lot to say about that.
I actually would like to...
Can I add to that?
Go ahead.
Yes, I think that whereas there's quite, there's a lot of studies which show that this sort of intersectional perspective really allows us to understand different types of political alliances, both for women and for men. So in that sense, there are clear ideological differences between different groups of women. So it's obvious that some women would be conservative. Why not? I mean, deeply religious women would be conservative, and that would be very aligned with their vision of reality. But I think that when we talk about this phenomenon or this trend of right-wing actors or anti-gender actors claiming that they're defending freedom of speech, for example, or they're defending liberal values, we should add to this mix or to this discussion the fact that they are doing this in a very strategic way, and they are taking over the language of liberals or the left, and they are not shy about it. In our book, we write about the Agenda Europe report, where which was leaked, where the members of the anti-gender sort of network, transnational network, talk very openly about the fact that they want to pollute the language, right? Because they know very well that the language is constructing the reality, and that once they start using notions such as minority rights or group rights or discrimination or freedom of speech in a very different context, that would actually make it much more difficult for progressive actors to act. And that's exactly what Pauline Cullen has shown, that once right-wing tries to colonize also the language and the issues which were traditionally connected to the left and being part of the left agenda, then it becomes very difficult for the leftist or for the feminist groups to operate on the political level. So in that sense, this is exactly the same. One example of this trend is, for example, the right-wing groups in Poland or the Juris in Poland, claiming that abortion, not claiming anymore that abortion is a sin, but rather claiming that abortion is better for women. And actually, they are protecting minority group, which is women, by limiting access to abortion. So this is a very different language that we are dealing with now, and this is not the old type of conservatism that we got used to during cultural wars in the 70s or 80s. So I think that we have to acknowledge that. Thank you.
I think it may be my job to stop the discussion now and make a few remarks to conclude, to remind us of the highlights of the discussion. So is that okay?
You can carry on for 5 more minutes if you want.
Okay.
Because I see another question in the chat.
So is there another question?
In the chat, yes. So if you want, you can.
Okay. Anita Tusor, would you like to read your question, or would you like me to read it? Okay, so the question is, when a manipulated public replaces the concept of unemployed with that of welfare recipient and the latter with that of Roma refugee migrant, at least in the Hungarian context, it is precisely the stakeholders who are mobilized against themselves in order to destroy the social system. How this plays out when the propaganda mobilizes women against their own interest. Can you give an example? Well, I guess since the question includes women mobilizing against their own interest, I think the anti-abortion campaigns would be the best example here, where women are interpolated by the populist right, along with the religious fundamentalists, as saviors of unborn babies, and the result of that is, as it is in Poland, a complete ban on abortion. And Ireland is an interesting case where that was actually countered by the women's movement effectively with a framing of abortion as healthcare, and a kind of call for empathy. I don't know if that answers the question. But actually, I think the problem with a lot of the gender talk of the populist right is that it is not necessarily or not obviously against women's interests. In other words, as I think Pauline very richly illustrated, there is a way in which some of this populist right-wing agenda actually co-opts successfully and pushes policies that may not be feminist but are obviously pro-women, but in a conservative way. And the examples here are, I think, quite disturbing to feminists who are too closely aligned with the neoliberal project. And in Poland, these were various welfare provisions, redistributive policies. There's a lot of that going on in places where the populists are in power. But I think it's a broader question. So I think it's wrong to assume that anti-genderism is necessarily anti-women. It could be pro-women, except woman is differently constructed, more as a caregiver than as an ambitious player in the in the capitalist world. Would anyone else like to speak to this?
I'd like just very. Oh, I'm sorry, Pauline, please.
No, I was going to say I was happy for you to wrap up, but if you have something to say, Eric, pop on.
No, I just wanted to say that I think it's important to recognize that not all women, it's the same way as not all LGBTQ plus people might agree that this is against their interest. They might actually understand their interest to be different. And that even if we disagree with that, it's important to recognize it because it allows us to enter into this in a way that's perhaps more tractionable, right? I'm sorry to have cut you off again, Pauline, please.
Are there any more? Okay, so I will be quite brief. I think we've touched on most of the issues in our discussion. I would just like to bring back the core definition of why gender is part of the populist discourse and why it is lamentable that the core theories of populism actually neglect this topic. And I think Elżbieta very elegantly summed this problem up, that if you look for gender on either the demand or the supply side, you end up with boring questions like how many women vote for Orban, or how sexy are the macho men in power, and what's the difference between men and women. These are not the interesting questions. The interesting question is, how has the populist right taken over the conversation on gender in Europe and beyond? And the answer to that is very complex, but the short version is they've done it very well. They've really resignified the term. They've used discourse on gender to bring a lot of affect into politics, as Nick discussed, to moralize politics, as Elżbieta was discussing, to thicken the ideological core of populism, to create, to strengthen polarization through various linguistic games that they play extremely well, as Eric illustrated. And I'd love to read a written version of this talk. There was a lot there. So I think we need to take anti-gender discourse and anti-gender campaigns seriously as a core space where populism happens. I guess I would like to speak very briefly to Pauline's presentation, which touches on something that I, as a feminist activist, find very disturbing and problematic, which is, and and again, I would like to read, and I hope I don't muddle what your point is, but if I understand it correctly, you're basically saying that feminist opposition to anti-gender campaigns and politics is complicated by the fact that those campaigns are actually aimed at very problematic, neglectful treatment of gender equality, which has been the case in the EU because of the way the EU project is, as you said, wedded to austerity. And this is something that I think we tried to phrase in our book as well, in the conclusions, where we talk about the fact that a lot of the anti-gender arguments, especially on care and motherhood, are differently phrased, but nonetheless very much resonant with some of the socialist feminist arguments made by people like Nancy Fraser. In other words, there really is a problem with motherhood in Europe, to put it very bluntly. And I think, I think your talk was very careful not to judge and not to evaluate these different strategies, but I sensed, I guess, or maybe I projected my own sense of despair about the inadequacy of mainstream feminist responses to the situation. And the situation has changed completely. Right-wing political players have positioned themselves successfully as defenders of women and defenders of ordinary families, and so the old-time feminist responses are simply inadequate. You cannot keep talking about human rights in this context. You cannot keep talking about gender indexes when this powerful, effective repertoire is bringing people by droves into the embrace of right-wing populists. Yeah, I'd like to end on a more optimistic note, and I guess my optimism is located in what you called feminist populism. But I wonder if that is still vibrant, and if so, where in Europe? I guess Ireland is a more optimistic place than Poland at this point. But yeah, that would be my summary of the main highlights, and I'm sure there were many others that I missed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, before closing this panel series, I just want to thank you, dear panelists, very much for the very insightful presentations. And thank you very, very much, Dr. Graf, for your attentive moderation. It's been very inspiring, very insightful. So thank you very much. Dear attendees, thank you for enriching the panel with your questions and remarks. This series so far has inaugurated the next stage in our Mapping European Populism panel series, and we will follow it in 1 month with our second thematic session, which is Populism and Migration. This thematic series will conclude with the third panel, which will be centered around populism and its effect to European Union resilience. After that, we will begin on mapping global populism, focusing on different countries and regions around the globe. So on behalf of the ECPS staff, thank you again for joining us, everyone. Take care and have a lovely evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks. Good to
Bye.
see everyone. Bye.